Today's the day. I am back on the 308, and what I'm doing is main bearing, oil clearance checks, end float, maybe bearing crush, and also rod bearing clearance checks as well. So I've made a nerdy checklist, which is going to guide me through doing this because I haven't done it before. I've researched a few different books to get a sense of how it should work. So I'm pretty confident that I've got the procedure right, but because I've never done it before, I want to be quite methodical in how I go about it. So I have already gone through a list of all the tools and bits and pieces that I need, and that's all laid out here. Going to start with cleaning and getting the main bearings ready. I've got a few notes here highlighted which are important things for me to pay attention to. So once that's all cleaned, I'll get started with main bearing clearance, end float and bearing crush tests. I'm using Plastigage to do the oil clearance checks. Haven't decided yet if I'm going to do it on all of the main bearings or maybe just 2 or 3 of them. We'll see. I'm also using ARP studs for the mains. So they have come with a particular lubricant which I'll need to use on the threads and the nuts and the washers for those. So that's why that's highlighted. And they have their own torque spec as well, so I'll be making sure to follow that. It's not too far off what the 308 factory torques should be, but I think they generally need to be a little bit higher with the ARP studs, so that's why they are 80 foot-pounds instead of the 60 to 70 foot-pounds that the Holden manual says. Now, bearing crush is not something I could find much information about. Gary, who I've mentioned before as my Holden mentor, he recommended that actually, and I think he found me a little bit of an instruction for how to figure out what the bearing crush should be. I don't know that it's all that essential, and what I have read is that if you get your oil clearances coming out pretty well to spec, you don't really need to worry about bearing crush, but because I'm here learning, I'm going to give it a whirl. And also the crank end float or play, Come Racing have a video on that on an actual 308, so I kind of learned a bit from what they did and made a bit of an instruction here. Then I'll see how far I get today, but if I've got time, I'll then start cleaning and prepping for rod bearing clearances and getting stuck into that. So that's the goal for today. And then if I reach that, I will pretty much be ready to turn my attention to possibly the scariest part of this build. Now, the scariest part of this build is the rear main seal, which I have chosen to use a rope rear main seal. Could be a mistake, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if I needed to get any machining done in order to use a neoprene or some other kind of rear main seal. We'll see. I just wanted to be authentic, so yeah, that's a question and a problem for another day. The block has been cleaned, including all these threads, but I'm just giving them a quick clean out with a thread chaser because it's been a little while since I did clean the block. Just want to make sure there's no grunge in there. There is lubricant, but there's no crud, but yeah, it doesn't hurt to check them. So I will get started with cleaning. And I'll start with the crankshaft. This has already been cleaned actually quite thoroughly, even the oil galleries through the journals there. And today I'm really just giving it the journals in particular, a bit of a once-over, so there's no grunge or excess lubricant on there. We have ACL bearings. So all the crank journals are clean. I have cleaned the main caps. I have checked over all the studs and nuts. They look good. Well, they're new, so they should be fine. I've already checked that they screw into the block okay. I've cleaned all the main bearings. So now I'm just going to put them into the block. For some reason I found in an instruction to put a little bit of lube on the bearings, but that doesn't make any sense if I'm going to be putting Plastigage on there. So I think that is actually a wrong step. I'm not going to do that. And then the crank will go into the block next. So the crank is in the block. It did have to come out again because I dropped the first piece of Plastigage down onto the cam and had to get that out. The ARP main studs, they just get screwed into the block hand tight with no lubricant, so that was done, well, main cap by main cap. And the same with the Plastigage. I ended up putting that onto every main journal. And then I did use ARP's lubricant to do the stud thread, the upper threads on the studs, the nuts and the washers. So they are all done, and all the main caps are on, but I have not tightened them. Whoops. They're just hand tight at the moment, so we are now at the stage of torquing them down. This is just getting the main caps down onto the block before I get a torque wrench. So with these ARP studs, the torque is 80 foot-pounds. I've done 30 all the way around and 55 all the way around, and now I'm going to find out if I'm strong enough to do 80. Maybe not. Last one. Yay. The only interesting thing is that, and it's probably because they're studs and they just get hand tightened into the block, but there's slightly different lengths of stud hanging out. That's probably got 3 threads hanging out. That one's probably got 4 threads hanging out. And I don't know if that's consequential or not. It could just be the way the lubricant kind of grabs or gives as the nuts are getting torqued down. But yeah, 3 or 4 threads hanging out. So I was in two minds about doing the bearing crush, but decided to do it on one main anyway. So what I've done is left this torqued, completely backed this one off, and then I'm going to put a feeler gauge in between the main cap and the block. And ideally it should be between 3 and 5 thou. And this is a 3, I can't do it with one hand. What's this one? That's a 3. Well, I had it in before, but I can't get it in now. Why would that be? There we go. Will it take a 4? No. It won't take a 4. So there we go. I don't know if that's worth doing or not, but that's what I did. So what seems to work is I've got to take the studs out and then tap the main caps loose until my little hands can lift them off with some level of control. There we go. And they're all pretty much coming out at pretty close to that 2 thou, maybe a tiny smidgen bigger, but not as much as the 1.5 thou, I think that one is. They're a bit smaller than that, so and definitely not as narrow as the 2.5 thou. So anyway, they're all coming out within spec. Right, so just keeping up with my checklist. Torqued everything down, obviously. Did not turn the crank in the engine. Did the bearing crush check on the number 5 main cap at the rear because I didn't really want to completely release only one side of every main cap, so that was more just for the experience of doing it. As it turned out, I think it is within spec anyway, but I'll put numbers on the screen just to confirm everything. So I didn't know what it was there, but I think we worked out before that it had to be between 3 and 5 thousandths of an inch, and I think it was 3 went in, but a 4 would not go in. So I'm pretty happy with that anyway. Bearing clearances, we've done that. I took the bolts out from the main caps, took the studs out as well because that just made it easier to tap the main caps free. And I did that with a combination of a rubber mallet and a brass drift and a hammer, just where I could get access depending on where the counterweights were on the crank. So, didn't destroy any of the Plastigage, which is good, and all of them came in at about 2 thou, which is within spec. It had to be between 0.00 0.08 of an inch to the 2.4 thou. So that all checks out. I've cleaned the Plastigage off the crank and off the main cap bearings and getting ready for an end float check. So the crank came out, put a little bit of this on the bearings, and then it's gone back in, and the studs, the nuts, have been nipped up a little bit, and then I just used a screwdriver to get between the block and the last counterweight on the crank and just shifted the crank as far forward as it would go, which was barely anything. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's time to check the end float. So now that that crank's moved all the way forward, these get nipped up a bit. Scotty thinks it's a good idea to get them all at equal torque. Not torqued up to spec, but just to a nice equal but lowish torque. And then I'll use the dial indicator and check how much end float we have. This is only 10 foot-pounds, just so they're all even. Don't know if it matters or not, but it takes no effort, I guess, so doesn't hurt to do it. Dial indicator set up against the back of the crank, and it's been zeroed. So now I'm going to move the crank back, and we should see that move. And that moved almost 2 thou, I guess, but not quite. Maybe I didn't lever it enough. Let's see what happens. Not getting enough purchase. No, that's it. So it's just shy of 2 thou, I would say. So this is the nerve-wracking thing, is have I got the screwdriver in a nice safe place? I can push it out to nearly 4 thou, but it wants to sit there at 2. It's got to be somewhere between 2 and 6 thou. So that seems like it's in the ballpark anyway. So just to check the process, instead of using a screwdriver to shift the crank back and forth, we used a rubber mallet. Scotty had seen that happen in some other situations. Got the same 2 thou and loosened off these. They were at 10 foot-pounds. Loosened them off and then just did them finger tight. Did it again, still got 2 thou of float. And then also checked it, shifting the crank in the other direction. So moving it, what did we do first? Did we move it forward and then moved it back? So whatever we did the first time, we did it the other way and still got 2 thou of float. So I think that's what we're living with, but it's okay. It's sort of within the range that we need. I'm happy enough with that. Where we're up to today is I realised I was not going to leave the crank in after doing the bearing clearance check because I wanted some lube on there, given that it was going to be sliding back and forth against bearings. So that's fine. So I had cleaned off the Plastigage already from the crank journals and from the main cap bearings. So we reinstalled the main caps, nipped them up, but also took them to 10 foot-pounds just for consistency. And as you saw, that didn't seem to matter because even releasing them and just nipping them up by hand, we're still getting the same 2 thou, or it's slightly more than 2 thou maybe of end float. So I had used the screwdriver to move the crankshaft fully backwards and forwards as part of that end float check, very carefully, of course, against the crank's counterweights and the block, not the main caps. So that's now done. There were different ways, of course, to measure end float. You could use a feeler gauge, but we used the dial indicator method, so that was easy enough. And as you saw, checking the end float, we got about a little bit more than 0.02 of an inch, but it needs to be between 2 and 6 thou, which seems fine. And that's enough, so I didn't have to do any modifications. So the crank has now been left in there with the caps just nipped down, and that is ready for the next step, which is rod bearing clearance checking. So that's where we come to next, back at the shed. So it's been fun today because, well, Scotty's here as he usually is, but also because my dad hung out with us today, which was really cool. I hope he comes and hangs out more when I'm playing with the engine or the motorbike or whatever. Anyway, next step, rod bearing oil clearance checking.